They mocked her quiet voice. In the war room, until she gave the order that silenced the enemy. The snow came early to the Ardennes in November of 1944. It came fast and hard, the kind that turned roads into mud before they froze solid overnight, and it grounded air support for 3 weeks running. Colonel Bernard Ashworth stood at the head of the briefing room in the 7th Corps Forward Command Post near Liege, Belgium, and he told the assembled staff officers what he thought of the situation. He told them for 11 minutes. He used the words catastrophic, hopeless, and ill-conceived in the same sentence. Then, he sat down and looked at the woman seated at the far left corner of the table. She had not spoken yet. She hadn't moved. Captain Margaret Elise Dowd was 31 years old. She had been assigned to 7 Corps as a signals intelligence analyst in September 1943, 14 months earlier, working out of a prefabricated Nissen hut on the outskirts of Aachen. She weighed 109 pounds. She wore wire-rimmed glasses that she had repaired twice herself with a length of field wire. She spoke in a voice that never rose above what a person needed to use inside a room. She had never raised it. Not in 14 months. Ashworth looked at her for 2 seconds, then looked away. The briefing was about 7th Panzer, specifically about where it was. The official position, sourced from 3rd Army reconnaissance and aerial photography taken before the weather grounded everything, placed the 7th Panzer Division holding a line 11 kilometers east of the Orth River. The line had not moved in 4 days. The intelligence summary, typed on 3 pages and distributed that morning, confirmed this. 12 officers in the room had read it. Most believed it. Margaret Dowd had not written the summary. She had written a different one. Her version was 4 pages, dated November 14th, 1944. It sat in a manila folder on the table in front of her, along with 11 intercepts she had personally translated from German in the preceding 96 hours. The folder was not circulated. It had been given to Major Franklin Hess, the G2 intelligence officer for 7 Corps, on November 12th. Hess had reviewed it, had returned it to her desk with a note that read, "Analysis inconsistent with reconnaissance data. Do not distribute." She kept the folder. Brought it to the briefing. Outside, the temperature was dropping past 0 Fahrenheit. The windows of the forward command post had frost on the inside. A generator ran somewhere in the building, its low mechanical hum vibrating through the floorboards. 3 staff officers on the far end of the table were passing a map back and forth. The map showed the Ardennes front. It showed 7th Panzer exactly where the official summary said it was. Margaret looked at the map, said nothing. Hess opened the briefing. He reviewed the official position. He reviewed the weather situation. He reviewed the supply corridor from Liege and the current fuel status for 3rd Army armor. He used 23 minutes on material Margaret had read 4 days ago. When he finished, he asked for questions. Colonel Ashworth spoke first. He asked about the German fuel supply situation. Hess answered. Lieutenant Colonel Tonner asked about the weather window. Hess deferred to a meteorology officer named Sergeant Wallace, who had been sitting in the back with a clipboard since the briefing began. Wallace said the weather could break by November 18th, maybe the 19th. Nobody asked about the 4-page folder. Margaret waited until the questions were done. Then she opened the folder and placed the top sheet on the table in front of her. She didn't stand up. She said, in her quiet voice, that she had a concern about the location of 7th Panzer. Ashworth didn't look at her. Hess looked at her briefly and then looked at his own notes. She continued. She said the 11 intercepts in the folder represented 3 separate German signals frequencies. 2 of which had been silent for 4 days. Not disrupted. Silent. The distinction mattered. Disrupted signals had pattern noise. Silent signals had none. In her 14 months of tracking German armored signals traffic in the Western Theater, she had seen this particular pattern twice before. Once before the Falaise Gap, and once before the September breakout attempt near Aachen. Both times, the silence meant movement. Large-scale, coordinated movement, the kind that required radio silence to achieve. Major Hess said the aerial reconnaissance was conclusive. Margaret said the last aerial reconnaissance was November 9th, 5 days ago. She said a Panzer division could move 60 kilometers in 5 days in winter conditions, assuming they moved at night, which the signals traffic suggested they had been doing. She put the 4-page analysis on the table. She said the column marked Section 3 contained the intercept times, frequencies, and her interpretation of each one. She asked if someone would like to read it. Nobody picked it up. Ashworth said, without looking at her, that the signals analysis was an interesting supplement to the confirmed reconnaissance position. He used the word supplement. Then he moved to the next item on the briefing agenda, which was the fuel allocation schedule for the following week. Margaret closed the folder, put it back in front of her. The briefing lasted another 40 minutes. Margaret did not speak again. When it ended and the officers began filing out, Major Hess stopped at her chair. He told her, quietly, that she needed to understand how these things worked. He said the reconnaissance data came from sources she didn't have full access to. He said her analysis was thorough but incomplete. He said it without unkindness. That was almost worse. She nodded, went back to the Nissen hut. The intercepts kept coming. That night, November 14th into November 15th, she logged 4 more, 2 on frequencies that had been silent for a week. They were brief, encoded, but the encoding matched a cipher pattern she had flagged in October, one associated with armored unit command traffic, not supply or support. She wrote it up, marked it urgent, sent it through the signals chain to Hess. By morning, it had not been acknowledged. She sent it again at 0600, at 0900. At noon, she walked the copy over herself and placed it on Hess's desk. He was not in the office. His aide said he was in conference with Colonel Ashworth and would be unavailable until 1400. The aide looked at Margaret's folder, didn't touch it. She went back to the Nissen hut, sat at her desk. The hut was cold. The 2 other analysts assigned to her section, Corporal Banks and Private First Class Norris, were working at their own stations. Banks had his coat on. Norris had a wool blanket over his shoulders. The single bulb light above Margaret's desk flickered when the generator load shifted. She pulled out a clean sheet of paper, wrote the date, November 15th, 1944, 12:15 hours. Wrote the location, Forward Command, 7 Corps, near Liege. Then she began writing the 3rd version of the analysis. This one expanded to include the overnight intercepts, the cipher pattern identification, and a projected movement estimate with 3 scenarios: conservative, moderate, and aggressive. The conservative scenario placed 7th Panzer already 18 kilometers west of the Orth River. The aggressive scenario placed it 31 kilometers west. She attached the 11 intercepts. Attached the 2 overnight editions, clipped everything together with a piece of wire she kept in her desk drawer. Wrote on the cover page, in her careful handwriting, urgent. Revised analysis. November 15th, 1944, Captain M.E. Dowd, Signals Intelligence. Then she walked the folder not to Hess, but to General Theodore Burkhalter, commanding officer of 7 Corps. This was not the way things were done. Burkhalter's aide, a young lieutenant named Casey, looked at the folder and at Margaret and asked her what her chain of command authorization was for a direct submission. She told him she was going around her chain of command because her chain of command had returned the analysis without action twice in 3 days. She said she needed 10 minutes with the general. Casey said that wasn't possible. She stood there. Casey said she would need to wait. She waited. 45 minutes. Standing in the hallway outside Burkhalter's office, 2 officers walked past and looked at her. She stood there. At 14:15, Burkhalter's door opened, and Burkhalter himself came out, not Casey. He looked at Margaret, looked at the folder she was holding. He had a reputation in 7 Corps for 2 things: moving fast and hating waste. He asked her what she had. She told him. Quietly, 4 minutes. No hedging, no apologies. She said 7th Panzer was not where the official summary said it was. She said she believed it had moved, possibly as far as 31 kilometers west. She said the signal's evidence was in the folder. She said if she was wrong, it cost him 10 minutes. She said if she was right, it cost a great deal more than that. Burkhalter took the folder, went back inside, closed the door. Margaret walked back to the Nissen hut, sat down. Banks looked at her. She didn't explain. She went back to the intercepts. An hour later, Casey came to the hut. He told her the general wanted to see her. Burkhalter had the folder open on his desk. The 11 intercepts spread out in sequence, her analysis notes beside them. He had also, in the past hour, requested a second aerial reconnaissance via a different channel than the standard one, using a high-altitude photographic unit attached to First Army. The request had been expedited. The prince would arrive in 2 to 4 hours, weather permitting. He asked her 3 questions: about the cipher pattern, about the silence duration on the 2 frequencies, about the November 9th reconnaissance coverage area and what, specifically, it had not covered. She answered all 3. He told her to stay available. She went back to the hut. The prince arrived at 1840. Burkhalter had them in his office. Margaret was called in at 1920. Hess was already there. So was Ashworth. None of them looked at her when she entered. The new prints showed the Orthe River Valley. They showed the road network east of Bastogne. They showed something the November 9th prints had not shown: track marks. A large number of them, crossing open ground 7 kilometers west of where 7th Panzer was officially located. The prints were taken at 1600 that afternoon. The track marks were fresh, pressed into frozen ground, running in a consistent directional pattern. Southwest, Burkhalter asked Hess when 7 Corps' right flank had last been assessed for armored contact. Hess said 4 days ago. Burkhalter looked at the prince for a moment. Then he looked at Margaret. He asked her what she thought the aggressive scenario implied for the timeline. She said that if the movement had begun no later than November 10th, consistent with the signal's silence, and if the track direction held, the forward elements of 7th Panzer could reach the N15 road junction at Bastogne within 72 hours, possibly fewer. The N15 was a critical supply artery. Losing it would cut the 101st Airborne's resupply chain and compromise the entire southern flank. Ashworth said that was speculation. Burkhalter said it was analysis. He said there was a difference. He picked up the telephone on his desk. Called First Army. Called Third Army. Called the 101st Airborne's commanding officer, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and told him to begin defensive preparations along his western perimeter beginning that night. He also requested immediate fighter-bomber support for November 16th, assuming weather clearance, with priority targeting of anything moving southwest on the Orth Valley roads. Then, he turned to Hess. He told Hess that Captain Dowd's analysis would be incorporated into all future intelligence summaries, not attached as a supplement. He told Hess that her intercepts would be reviewed daily by the G2 office, and that any conflict between signals intelligence and reconnaissance data would be resolved by comparison, not by default to either source. He did not raise his voice. He was done in 4 minutes. Margaret left the building at 19:55. The temperature outside was -8 Fahrenheit. The generator was running. The snow had stopped. The sky was clearing, which meant the morning might give them air support for the first time in 11 days. She went back to the hut. Banks and Norris were still there. She sat down, pulled the next intercept batch toward her, started reading. There were 6 intercepts waiting. She went through them in order. 4 were routine. The 5th was on the same frequency that had gone silent November 10th. It was brief. 43 characters. She decoded it against the cipher pattern she had flagged in October. The result was a partial unit designation and a grid reference. The grid reference was west of the Orth River, 11 kilometers west. She wrote it up, marked it in red, placed it on top of the stack. The 6th intercept was on a frequency she hadn't seen active in 3 weeks. She cross-referenced it against her logbook. Found the last active date, October 22nd. Found the unit designation associated with it from an earlier intercept batch, 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, attached to 7th Panzer Division. She sat for a moment with that. Then she wrote it at the bottom of the page, underlined it once, and added a note. If 25th PGR is moving with 7th Panzer and now on this frequency, this suggests regimental-level command coordination, not supply. Combat-oriented. Banks looked at her from across the hut. She slid the page toward him. He read it, said nothing, looked at the frequency chart on the wall. Looked back at her. She nodded. That was all. The weather cleared on November 16th. Fighter bombers from IX Tactical Air Command flew 34 sorties over the Ortha Valley between 0800 and 1600. The second sortie, at 0930, spotted an armored column moving southwest on the secondary road network 4 kilometers east of Bastogne. The column was approximately 2 kilometers in length. It included tanks. Mark the 4 and Mark 5. The reconnaissance report said. The column was 11 kilometers farther west than the official intelligence summary had placed 7th Panzer as of November 14th. The 101st Airborne had spent the previous night reinforcing its western perimeter. The airstrikes on November 16th destroyed or disabled 23 vehicles in the column. The column slowed, then stopped. The N15 junction at Bastogne was not reached. By nightfall on November 16th, 7 corps had repositioned 2 artillery battalions to cover the western approach roads and requested a mechanized infantry unit from 3rd Army Reserve. The request was approved the next morning. By November 18th, the western perimeter at Bastogne was reinforced by 640 additional troops and 14 self-propelled guns. The gap 7th Panzer had been moving toward no longer existed. Margaret Dowd did not see any of this directly. She was in the Nissen hut. She heard the aircraft in the morning. She logged 7 intercepts by noon. At 1400, an aide came from Burkhalter's office with a memo. The memo was brief. It said the intercept analysis had been forwarded to 1st Army with a commendation attached. Hess did not come to the hut that day. He came the following morning. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat across from her desk. He told her the November 12th memo had been an error. He used that word. Error. He said it carefully, like a man measuring weight. He did not apologize. She told him she understood. He asked about the current intercept traffic. She showed him. They worked for 2 hours, side by side, at the same table where the November 12th memo had been written. By noon, they had produced a joint analysis, signed by both of them, placed on the G2 distribution list. The first joint analysis Margaret Dowd had co-signed in 14 months. Ashworth never spoke to her directly about the Bastogne incident. He didn't need to. In December 1944, during the weeks of fighting that followed across the Ardennes front, Margaret Dowd's intercept section logged 312 German signals transmissions. She identified 7 distinct cipher patterns across 3 operational theaters. Her analysis was cited in 19 intelligence summaries distributed to Corps and Army level. General Burkhalter mentioned her work by name in a report to 1st Army Headquarters dated December 28th. She was promoted to Major in January 1945. The promotion was not ceremonial. There was no gathering, no formal presentation. Hess informed her in the morning. She went back to work that afternoon. The intercepts didn't stop because a rank changed. By the end of the Ardennes campaign, in late January 1945, the intercept section she ran had expanded from 3 analysts to 11. She trained each of them herself. She had a method for cipher pattern identification that she developed from her own notes over 14 months, handwritten in a green-covered logbook she carried in her coat pocket. The method didn't have a name. She never gave it one. She just used it. Banks, who had been with her since Aachen, said later that she taught it by showing, not explaining. Sit down. Look at the frequency. Look at the silence. Understand what's not there, same as what is. He said she never told anyone they were wrong. She just asked what they saw, and then showed them what else was there. The method was codified in a brief technical annex she wrote in February 1945. 9 pages, attached to a larger 1st Army Signals Intelligence Report. The annex was titled, plainly, Notes on Frequency Silence as Indicator of Armored Movement. It was distributed internally to 4 signals intelligence sections across the Western Theater. A revised version, expanded to 18 pages, was incorporated into the Army Intelligence Center training curriculum in 1947. Margaret was not credited by name in the curriculum version. Her annex was listed in a footnote as 7 Corps Field Report, November 1944. She never mentioned this to anyone. Norris said she made good coffee. That was what he said. She made good coffee in the cold of the Nissen hut, and she read intercepts all night, and in the morning the coffee was still warm somehow, and the work was done. Margaret Elise Dowd was discharged in October 1945. She returned to Galveston County, Texas, where she had grown up on a stretch of flat coastal land between the bay and the Gulf. She took a position teaching mathematics at Ball High School in Galveston in September 1946, where she taught for 31 years. She retired in 1976 at age 63. She taught algebra, geometry, and trigonometry. She was not a famous teacher. Her students remembered her as quiet and precise. She did not give extra credit. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised it in 31 years of standing in front of rooms full of people. She kept the green logbook. It sat on a shelf in her home office above a desk where she graded papers and, later, did nothing in particular. The shelf also held a 1944 edition of German military ciphers, an analytical reference, water-stained, spine cracked, with margin notes in pencil throughout. It held a topographic map of the Ardennes region, folded to a specific section, folded the same way since 1945. It held a photograph, a group of 8 people standing outside a Nissen hut, taken in winter light sometime in early 1945. Margaret is on the far left. She is the only woman in the photograph. She is the only one not looking at the camera. She is looking slightly to the left, at something outside the frame. The photograph is 4 inches by 3 inches, printed on Kodak stock. The logbook was 214 pages. Every page had entries in her careful handwriting, intercept times, frequencies, cipher codes, margin notes in the form of questions she'd asked herself and then answered. It was not a diary. It was a working document. The difference mattered to her. In 1983, a researcher from the Military Intelligence Corps History Office contacted her about the Ardennes Intercept record. He was writing an institutional history. He had found her name in Burkhalter's December 1944 report and in the January 1945 promotion record. He drove to Galveston and sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours. She showed him the logbook, let him photograph 12 pages. She answered every question he asked. When his history was published in 1985, it contained 4 paragraphs on the 7 Corps' signals intelligence operation during the Ardennes campaign. One paragraph mentioned Captain Margaret Dowd's analysis by name and noted that it had contributed to the defensive preparations at Bastogne in November 1944. She read those 4 paragraphs, put the book on the shelf next to the logbook. She died in Galveston County in 1997 at the age of 84. The house was sold, the contents donated and dispersed. The logbook went to the Military Intelligence Corps Museum at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where it is held in the archival collection. It is available to researchers by appointment. The logbook is 214 pages. Her handwriting is even throughout. The last entry is dated October 12, 1945. The second to last entry, from October 9th, is an intercept analysis, 3 pages long, written in the same method she'd used since the beginning. Frequency, silence, pattern, interpretation. She finished it, and then moved to the next page and started something else. She didn't write a conclusion, just kept working. The researcher who visited her in 1983 asked, at the end of 3 hours, whether she had ever felt that her analysis wasn't being taken seriously because of who she was. She thought about the question for a moment. She said that in her experience, the problem was never about who she was. The problem was that the evidence she had was inconvenient. Inconvenient evidence is uncomfortable regardless of who brings it. She said the answer, in all cases, was to make the evidence so clear that the discomfort of ignoring it became greater than the discomfort of accepting it. She said she had not always succeeded at that. She said November 14, 1944 was a case where she had. The researcher wrote that down. He used it in one sentence of the 4-paragraph section. The sentence read, Dowd later described her approach as making the evidence impossible to dismiss. She read that sentence in 1985 and set the book back on the shelf. Still there. Still just the logbook and patience.